Now, we began our discussion about Shalol Lishma, which is a machshava poseles that divides up into two categories. Just to very quickly review, we have a Shinui Kodesh, which means instead of having in mind this mincha, he has in mind a different mincha. And we have Shinui Bailin, where instead of having in mind that he's doing the Kmitza Naktara on behalf of Ruvain, he has, who's the Bailin of this mincha, he has in mind the kapar of Shimon. Now, we mentioned that there are other avodos besides the big four in Menachos. Big four include Kmitza, Nesinas HaKometz B'Kli, Holachas HaKometz L'Mizbeach, and Haktoras HaKometz Al Mizbeach. But there are another two avodas that come before Kmitza, and they are Tnufa and Hagosha. And we said that these do not passel the korban, even if he has a machshavas, Shinui Kodesh, or Shinui Hashem, Shinui Baal. And again, as we pointed out last time, this is the last piece of review before we go further, that the psul of Shalol Lishma in Menachos is derived from Avodas Dam in Zvachim. And in Avodas Dam in Zvachim, there are only 4 avodas. Maybe it's a little bit different, because in addition to the 4 avodos, we have Tnufa and Agosh, but they don't fit into this mirror image because they have no parallel in Zvachim. And Tosfos adds another point here, that a machshava poseles is not applicable to Hagosha, because Hagosha takes place before Kmitza. And Kmitza, in the parallel of the 4 and the 4, is Keneged Shchita. And Hagosha is taking place before Shchita. In Zvachim, which is our Malamed, that's the teacher, the prime case, there is no avoda that comes before Shchita. So the earliest time for the Kohen to possibly have a machshava poseles would be Shchita. And in the parallel case, it would be Kmitza in Menachos, and Hagosha is before. All right, that's what we covered more or less yesterday. Now we move on to a topic which is called Shinui Achar Shinui. And it means that even after he did one particular avoda of the 4 with a machshava poseles of Shinui, he's not allowed to do the other avodos with a machshava of Shinui. That's called an Isur of Shinui Lachar Shinui. You and I would have said, well, look, he messed it up already. It's like, let's say a Kohen would go into Beis HaKvaros. So he might as well hop around. You know, once he's in the Beis HaKvaros, hop around from one kever to the other. He's already tamei anyway. So here also, you might have thought, well, look, he already messed up with an avoda, with a machshava poseles, let's say during Shchita. He might as well have a similar machshava of Shinui when he does the halacha and the zrika and so forth. Or in the case of Menachos, if he already had the machshava at the time of the Kmitza, why not have another mess up during the other avodos of halacha and haktar, etc.? But the answer is no. He has to do all the avodos lishma, and Rava claims that this is a din pashut mismara. We're not going to be matir him to do the other avodos with the shinui just because he messed up on the previous avod that he did it for shinui. However, Rava also tells us that he has support from a pasuk, and the pasuk is in Dvarim Chav Beis. It says, "Motza svasecha tishmar v'asisa kasher nadarta l'Hashem Elokecha nedava." And it's very strange. The pasuk opens up with a neder, and it says v'asisa kasher nadarta, and then the last word of the pasuk is nedava. What is going on here? You open with neder and you complete with nedava. Pasach b'neder v'siyem b'nedava. Says Rabbi Lamdenu, this is meant to teach us that, quote, im kemoshen adarta asisa, you took a neder and you fulfilled your pledge, vekravta es nidarecha lishmo, then it's a neder, which means it's ola l'shem chova. That's the case of lishmo. V'im lo ikravta lishmo, yeh kosher kinidava. Then it falls into a lower category. It's no longer a fulfillment of motzva secha tishmar, the asisa kasher nadarta, because it's shalom lishmo. But it falls into a category called nidava, which is mentioned at the end of the pasuk. And he's going to have to replace this carbon with another carbon because lo olu l'baylim l'shem chova. But he does get credit for nidava. Umikach shekara akosav nidava muchach she'osur lahamshich u'lashanos b'shar avodos, meaning that the carbon is still a carbon. Again, it's not a carbon chova to fulfill its neder, it's a carbon nidava, but nevertheless it still has a status as a valid carbon. And therefore, says Rava, we're not going to allow you to continue the avoda of a carbon nidava with a machshav shelo lishma. The halachas of avoda continue to apply even in the case of nidava. And therefore, gam b'nidava osur l'shanos v'tzarich lakriva l'shma. So just to summarize, the Gemara in the name of Rava begins with svara. And the svara is that just because the Kohen messed up on one avoda with a machshava shelo l'shma, that doesn't allow him to do the other avoda shelo l'shma. And the Gemara says that Rava also had a pasuk which began with neder and concluded with nidava, and therefore once the carbon switched, it was transferred from one level down to another level, from a neder to a nidava, but nevertheless it still retains its status as a carbon kosher. Then every avoda generates a chiyuv of lishma. And now he quotes a Rashi. This Rashi is at the beginning of Masechta Zvachim. And Rashi writes that Mimasha Nemar B'Pigul, in Vayikra Perik Zion, it says, Hamakrivo so lo yechoshev, Mikan lemedim isa lechol machshavos. So when you have a status of a makriv, the Kohen is a Kohen makriv, the Torah says lo yachshav, lo yechoshev, which means he's not allowed to have machshavos haposel. And that applies not only to Pigul, which is the context in which the pasuk is written, but to all machshavos of shelo lishma as well. And therefore Rashi is telling us that the pasuk lo yechoshev is a source for this halacha of an iser shinui achar shinui. After you were meshana with a machshava shelo lishma in the first avoda or an earlier avoda, you are still enjoined lo yechoshev because you still have the status of a kohen makriv from having a machshava of shelo lishma in the subsequent avodas. And now at this point he quotes another Rashi, not the Rashi in Zvachim. Just 1 second, I'm a little confused here. Where is this from? Yeah, it seems like it's also a Rashi in Zvachim. And he has a whole list of achronim who try to reconcile these two Rashis. But anyway, what's the second Rashi? He says that the source for the Iser of Shinui Achar Shinui is a pasuk in Vayikra Gimel. And it says, V'im Zebach Shlomim Karbanot. And Rashi says, Lomadnu shetzarch sheteis vicha l'shem Shlomim, the af shalmi nidava b'chlal. In other words, after he does his first Shinui, the carbon now becomes a carbon nidava. And with regard to Korban Nedava, the Torah says, Shlomim Korbano, which means Vichel Shem Shlomim. And yet, the Torah says that even after it loses its status as a Korban Shlomim, now it becomes a Korban Nedava, but nevertheless, a Korban Nedava is also included in this puzzle, because it's no less a Zevach Korbano than a Shlomim Zevach Korbano. Now, the question is, when does this Isur of Shinui Achar Shinui apply? So we're going to start with the Shita of the Merkeves HaMishnah, one of the super commentaries on the Rambam, a Sfaradi from almost 3 centuries ago. And he writes the following, that this Isur of Shinui Achar Shinui, Noeg Rak B'Shinui Kodesh, V'lo B'Shinui Bailim. As we said before, there are 2 categories of Shinui in Shalol Lishma. The first is called a Shinui Kodesh. Means he has in mind a different karma, not this karma, but a different karma. And there we have an Isur of Shinui Liachar Shinui, but not in the case of Shinui Bailim. Why? Apparently, the Merkeves HaMishnah understood that once you had a machshava of Shinui Bailim, you've already changed the kapara of this karma, and you redirected it towards another individual other than the Bailim. The Bailim now no longer have kapara power, so to speak, or potential for kapara in this karma. So the fact that he does another avodah subsequently, and again he has in mind Shinui Bailim, hasn't changed anything. It's already etched in stone that this karban can no longer be related as a kapara for this bailim. So by adding another machshava of shalol l'shem bailim, you haven't changed the thing. You didn't accomplish anything, and therefore there's no isur involved. Ein bo kapara. It's not Ol L'Shem Bailim, and therefore it's not a Mechaper. Again, when he says it's not a Mechaper, we have to be a little careful here. I don't think the Merkeves HaMishnah means that he has no Kapara from it whatsoever. It's not Ol Bailim L'Shem Chovo, but nevertheless it is a Korban Nedava. But as such, you haven't changed anything with the subsequent Shinui Bailim. Machshava Shinui Bailim number 2 does not add anything to the Shinui Bailim number 1. You've already frozen the status of this karban. It's no longer a chova. In other words, that kapar that he needs, l'shem chova, he cannot achieve this bailam nebuch because of the Kohen. Maybe he has to sue the Kohen for damages. I don't mean that as a joke. But now he quotes the Chafetz Chaim, who wrote a magnum opus on Kodshim, which is called Likutei Halachos. And af Shinui Bailim liachar Shinui Bailim also. He disagrees with the Merkeves HaMishnah. I'm not sure if he quotes the Merkeves HaMishnah and then disagrees with him, but nevertheless he assumes that there's an Isur of Shinui Achar Shinui, even in the case of Shinui Bailim. Now, it seems to me, and I might be way off here, that the Chafetz Chaim understood that the Isur of Shinui is not because of the impact it has in the karma. From that perspective, Merkeves HaMishnah is 1,000% correct. Whatever impact you've had on the karma has already been clinched with the first machshava Shinui Bailim. You've already removed the Bailim from it, whatever kapara power he had in this karma. But rather, the Chafetz Chaim holds that there's a separate halacha in avoda, that the avoda has to be lishma, and there are 4 avodas. Each avoda independently generates an obligation to have a machshava lishma, and Shinui Bailim is machshava shalol lishma. Forget about what impact it'll have or won't have on the carbon. It's an avoda. It's halacha during the avoda. if I want to give a mashal, but don't take me, literally, it's not a literal analogy, but there's a training process. The Kohen has to train himself, so to speak, to have the proper machshava in every one of the avodas. All of a sudden he says, oh, I messed up on one avodah, I might as well mess up on the other avodas. That's not good training. Imagine the case of let's say a 12-year-old boy, and you're trying to train him to fast on Yom Kippur. And by mistake, the boy ate something on Yom Kippur. So we're going to say, all right, now feed him again on Yom Kippur? It's a training process. The Yesh Mish's topic, the Dover and the Taras HaKodesh vacillated back and forth whether or not he holds like the Merkavas Mishnah or accept the opinion of the Chafetz Chaim. Now, the next paragraph introduces a sugya that always gives me sort of like hives, because we learned this back in Talmud Mishpat in Psachim, and it was such a complicated sugya. And it kicks in here to Menachos as well. And that's called Lishma v'Shalol Lishma. Meaning, the Kohen could have a double machshava. At the same time, he's having a machshava Lishma, and having a machshava Shalol Lishma. And halacha is, this is a Mishnah at the beginning of Zvachim, Kishem shemachsheves Shalol Lishma poseles, Kach machsheves Lishma v'Shalol Lishma, O Shalol Lishma v'Lishma posel. Any admixture of a machshava Shalol Lishma, it matters not whether he started with a machshava Shalol Lishma or he ended with a machshava Shalol Lishma, it's a machshava poseles, even though he had in mind Lishma as well. So the Lishma is kind of neutral. It creates a potential that if everything goes well, the carbon is kosher. But it doesn't have a chazaka to it. It doesn't grab onto the carbon and fix it in stone. It's neutral. Now he has a machshava of Shalol Lishma, that's a machshava poseles. And now he quotes the Gemara in Talmud Mishpat. And the shita of Rabbi Meir is that this psul of Shalol Lishma and Lishma only applies if he began with his initial machshava was Shalol Lishma, and then he had a machshava Lishma, then it's possible. But if in the reverse case he began with a machshava Lishma, Rabbi Meir's opinion is that even if subsequently he had a machshava Shalol Lishma, the carbon is kosher. And this is called, in the language of Rabbi Meir, Tfos Lashon Rishon. That we don't assume that when a person changes his mind, he now retroactively undermines his original machshava, but on the contrary, the machshava that's kovea is the first machshava. So that once he started the avoda with the machshava Lishma, he has now fixed the carbon in stone. It's fixed in stone. It's Tfos Lashon Rishon. And therefore, L'das Rabbi Meir, Sul Lishma v'Shalol Lishma, hu rak b'ofen she'osa avoda achas Lishma, v'avoda acheres Shalol Lishma. Oh, so if you have two different avodos, Shkita and Kabbalah, and he had, for example, a machshava of Lishma in the Shkita, a machshava of Shalol Lishma in the Kabbalah Sadam, then it's possible. The carbon is possible. Because every avoda is independent and sets up its own machshava. If he had two contradictory machshavas within the same avoda, a carbon kosher. Why? Because Tfos Lashon Rishon. And he started with the machshava of Lishma. And within the same avoda, he switched his what's it called, his channel, and now he has a machshava of Shalol Lishma. that will not change his original machshava of lishma. The korban remains kosher because it's false lashon reach. If on the other hand he starts and concludes one machshava with lishma, then he gets to the second machshava, the second avoda, and he has a machshava shalol lishma, then even Reb Meir would agree that the korban is false. Rabbi Yossi says no. The Gemar Dvorov Adam Nitfas means that even if he started with one machshava and then he negated that machshava, the negation in an opposite, right, in a way that excludes the first machshava, that last machshava is hal. It registers, and that's called tfos. Gemar Dvorov Adam Nitfas. Therefore, according to Rabbi Yossi, if the Kohen started with the machshava of lishma, and then he continued with the machshava shalol lishma in the same avoda, where Rabbi Meir says there's no such thing as a psul once he began with the machshava lishma, and that's called false lashon rishon. According to the Shita Rabbi Yossi, bigmar dvarav hadam nitfas, and if in the same avoda he switched from an initial machshava lishma to an end machshava of shalol lishma, the korban is possible. And Kodshim, again, if he switched it in another avodah, then even Rabbi Meir would agree that it's possible. But we're talking within the same avodah. Okay, now we get to Rabbi Shimon. Okay, we're doing well. I mean, we're doing better than I thought. But now we get to the sheet of Rabbi Shimon. The Gemara quotes a brisa in the name of Rabbi Shimon, trying to see where this brisa is. I'm not sure. Let me just see. I have a Gemara here in front of me. I want to see if this is here in Menachos. Yeah. So this Gemara of Rabbi Shimon is at the beginning of Masechta Menachos on Daf Beis Amid Beis. Okay then? Kol HaMenachos shenikmitzu shalol lishman sheros v'olu lebailim l'shem chol. This is, at the face of it, antithetical to everything we've said. He has a machshava shalol lishma at the time of Kmitza. Kmitza is a major avoda in Menachos. And he says, Olu l'bayim l'shem chol. So Rava says, you know what Reb Shimon has in mind? That Shinui Kodesh posel bizvachim v'lo b'menachos. Wow. According to Rava, Reb Shimon has a very radical sheet. The psul of Shini Kodesh, which that's the real McCoy Shalol Lishma, doesn't apply beyond Zvachim. It doesn't apply in Menachos. Let's just try to think about this for a moment on our own, and then we'll see what Rava actually said. In the case of a Zevach, there's no indication who the Bailim are. We know that the Bailim are Ruvain and Shimon, but in the Zevach itself, it could go any way. It could be it's your Zevach, it's my Zevach. And there, the Shinui Kodesh No. I'm sorry. Let me start again. Just scratch what I just said. In Menachos also, we don't know, nobody can indicate who the Bailam is. So what I said is wrong. In the case of Zvachim, we don't know if this animal is an Ola, if it's a Chatos, if it's an Asham, if it's Shlamim. So you say about an Ola that it's Shlamim, Shlam Ola, you're really messing us up big time. But in Menachos, we have different categories of Menachos, and each one is different. It's not like the standard 4 avodas in Zvach. Let's see what Rabbah says. Das Rabbah shini kodesh posel rak bizvachim v'lo b'menachos. Shekain b'menachos nikar al kol mincha mayi. V'im kamatz osa l'shem mincha cheres nikar al machshavto shi machsheves sheker. V'al kein einu machsheves l'klum v'ein do bo kedei lipos. I wish he would have fleshed it out a little bit more. Oh, there's a footnote. Maybe that'll help us. Higon bekometz minchas machlas l'shem marcheshes o mincha blula l'shem chareva. In other words, the Kohen is making a statement that clearly it's sheker, because we're looking at a mincha of one sort, and he's saying that he's doing the kmitza for another mincha. What do you mean for another mincha? This is not the mincha that you're dealing with, that you're doing the avoda on. This is a minchas machlas, and now you're telling me, well, I'm doing the. He makes an announcement. I'm doing the kmitza for a minchas marcheshes. It's not a minchas marcheshes. It's a minchas mach. It's on the pan. Or there are two types of menachos. There's a mincha chareva and a mincha blula b'shemen. He's got a mincha blula b'shemen, and he makes a declaration: I'm doing the kmitza for the purpose of a mincha yevesha chareva. Obviously sheker. Now you might say that if it's obvious sheker, adarabah, that should be more of a reason to passel the korban. Says Rabbah, no. If it's clear and nikar to everyone, and it's sheker, then it's dvar b'teilim. It doesn't register on the Richter scale. It's meaningless, and it does if it's not going to passel the korban. Shekain b'menachos nikar al kol mincha mai. Im kometz also l'shem mincha cheres nikar al machshavti shi machshevet sheker is garnished al kein ein nechsheves l'klum the ein ba kedei lives. Avol b'machsheves shini bailim moder Rabbi Shimon shi psula gam b'menachos sharei nikar oleh shi sheker. You look at the mincha, you have no clue whether it's Ruvain's mincha, Shimon's mincha, etc. It's in yours or it's mine. And now the shinui, when the Kohen makes a declaration that I'm bringing this mincha, I'm doing the avodah on behalf of Shimon and not on behalf of Ruvain, that's clearly, I mean, it's not sheker, we don't know it's sheker, we don't know if it's Shimon or it's Ruvain, but it's clearly a shinui in the very same bailam of the korban. The enonikar oleh she sheker, different registers, and it disqualifies the korban, the mincha. So again, it's not that Reb Shimon completely rejects the concept of shalol lishma zemachshava aposelos in menachos, but he severely limits it. And he's going to say that although in Shinui Bailim there is a machshava aposelos, that's Shinui, but in the case of Shinui Kodesh, ridiculous, a joke. What do you mean? It's a minchas marcheshes. Minchas makros. You're telling me it's a mincha yevesha, chareba? It's a mincha sheyesh ba shemen, lula b'shemen. You mean to say stupidities? That's not a posel. All that is abai. Rava Omar bedaito betamot shel Rabbi Shimon u'mishum shenemar the pasuk says by Yikravav zos toras hamincha. What do we learn from zos toras hamincha? Mikan. From here we're going to learn shetorah achas l'chol haminochos. Okay, Torah achas l'chol haminochos. What does that have to do with us? The ein machsheva shinui mimincha achas l'chaver to poseles. All the minachas have the same status, and they're all ksheros. And therefore, machshava shinui from one mincha to another mincha could not pass it. Because Torah achas l'chol minachos. So Rava seems to be totally not ignorant. What's the word I'm looking for? We'll call it unconcerned with the shita that we saw in Abaye. I'm sorry, in Rabbah, that it's nikar sheker. Forget about nikar sheker. It's halach of zos Torah samin. Avalim kovetz minchol shem zevach. Moder of Shimon Shi Psula. Very strange. Very, very strange. Now it's kol menachos Torah achas lehen. So if he switches from one mincha to the other, it doesn't undermine the kashrus of the mincha. But if he does a kmitza on a mincha for the purpose of a zevach, that's considered a machshava poseres. Okay, then, so that's where we're going to stop here.